water filtration to building habitat to shoreline stabilization, all those.
This is what a reef looks like when it comes back to life. Now picture that happening across an entire coastline, built from 500,000 tons of shells nobody wanted.
In simple terms, we're putting oyster reefs back where they used to be.
Florida dumped 500,000 tons of oyster shells into the Gulf of Mexico, and everyone was sure they'd just made things worse. What formed instead is something no one saw coming. The shells were the empty leftovers scraped off 1 million restaurant plates, the waste that normally goes straight to a landfill. Over 17 years, Florida sank more than 500,000 tons of them into coastal Gulf waters where the old oyster reefs had died off. Critics called it exactly what it looked like: reckless dumping, hiding garbage in a sea that was already sick. They were wrong. Because down on that dead, sandy seafloor, out of sight, the shells were quietly turning into something that would bring the whole coast back to life. The plan they called dumping. To understand what formed on that seafloor, you first have to understand how dead it was. For decades, the oyster reefs off Florida's coast had been dying off. Storms battered them, and pollution wore them down. And then, in 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster poured hundreds of millions of gallons of oil and chemicals into the Gulf, gutting an ecosystem that was already barely hanging on. Scientists estimate that around 90% of the world's oyster reefs have already been lost, and along stretches of the Florida coast, the reefs that once teemed with life had flattened into bare, soft sand, with nothing left alive and nothing solid for new life to build on. So somebody came up with an idea that, at first, sounded almost crazy. Every year, seafood restaurants and processing plants throw out enormous amounts of empty oyster and clam shells, the leftovers of 1 million dinners. All of it headed for the landfill. And that waste got someone thinking. He wondered whether giving the shells back to the sea, instead of burying them, might be exactly what the dead seafloor needed. Starting in 2007, that's what Florida set out to do. Over the next 17 years, the state collected and returned more than 500,000 tons of recycled shells to the coastal Gulf, laying them down in the very places where the old reefs had died. The public reaction was not applause. To a lot of people watching shells get dropped into the water by the ton, this didn't look like restoration at all. It looked like dumping, like taking garbage nobody wanted and hiding it in an ocean that was already sick. Critics called it reckless. And for a long time, even the scientists running the project couldn't prove them wrong, because when they looked at the water, they saw nothing at all. Year after year, the seafloor just sat there, and the doubt grew louder. But down there in the dark, where no one was looking, they were wrong. The shells were not sitting idle. Something was already taking shape on that dead seafloor, and by the time it broke the surface as visible proof, what had formed was a living oyster reef where there had been nothing but sand, spreading on its own and cleaning the water around it. A single oyster filtering as much as 50 gallons a day. In time, by reported accounts, turtles and dolphins would move back into these waters in numbers not seen in over a quarter of a century. The garbage everyone wanted to stop dumping had quietly become the foundation of an entire ecosystem. The only question left was how a pile of dead shells could possibly pull that off. Biofilm and chemistry. The answer is that the shells were never really dead material. The moment they hit the seafloor, they became something living things could use, and the first stage of that happened on a scale far too small for anyone to see. Within days, the surface of every shell started attracting microscopic life. Bacteria and other tiny organisms drifting in the water settled onto the shells and began to coat them in a thin, slippery layer called a biofilm. It doesn't look like much, just a film you'd barely notice, But it's one of the most important things that can happen on a bare surface. Underwater. It's the first step, the one that has to come before any of the rest. Before anything bigger can move in, this living skin has to form, because it turns a hard, empty surface into a place where new life can actually take hold. While that was happening on the outside, something else was happening to the shells themselves. Slowly, they began to break down, and as they did, they released calcium into the water around them. That sounds like a small chemical detail, but it mattered, because that calcium changed the makeup of the water in little pockets right around the shells, creating tiny zones with exactly the chemistry that certain marine organisms need in order to survive and take hold. So put those two things together. On the surface, a living film formed the first foothold for new life. In the water around them, small chemical changes tilting the conditions toward survival. Neither of those shows up when you look down at the Gulf from a boat. There was no reef yet, and nothing a critic could point to and call a success. And that's the whole reason the project looked like a failure for so long. Everyone was waiting to see something big appear, while the real work was happening one microscopic layer at a time, quietly setting the table for what came next. The missing foundation. Here's what the table was being set for. Oysters don't just appear out of the water fully grown. They start life as tiny larvae, called spat, drifting on the currents and searching for one thing above all else, a hard surface to land on. That's the single thing an oyster can't live without. If a young oyster can't find something solid to attach to, it has nowhere to settle, and it simply doesn't survive. And this was the exact problem the dead seafloor couldn't solve. When the old reefs disappeared, they took all that hard surface with them, and what was left behind was soft, shifting sand. To a drifting oyster larva, sand is useless. It can't grip it, and anything that tries to settle there just sinks into the muck and is lost. So the seafloor had become a place where oysters couldn't even begin. Even though the water was still full of young oysters looking for a home, there was no home for them to find. The reefs couldn't rebuild themselves because the one thing they needed to start from was the very thing that had been destroyed. And that's the gap the recycled shells stepped into. Once those shells were down on the seafloor, coated in biofilm and ready, they became exactly the hard surface the spat had been missing. All at once, the drifting larvae had somewhere to land. They settled onto the old shells and began to grow, a new generation of oysters anchoring to the leftovers of an old one. And that's where it turned into something self-sustaining. Because an oyster isn't just a creature that needs a hard surface, it becomes one. As the new oysters grew, their shells added more solid structure to the seafloor, which gave the next wave of spat even more surface to land on, which grew into more oysters still. The reef had started to build itself, each generation laying down the foundation for the one after it, exactly the way the original reefs had grown in the first place. All it had ever needed was that first solid thing to hold on to. And once the oysters came back, they didn't just rebuild a reef. They started to change the water itself. Ecosystem recovery. This is where the whole thing pays off, because a single oyster is a natural water cleaning machine. As it feeds, it draws water in, strains out the algae and floating bits of grime, and pushes it back out cleaner than it came in. And it does this constantly, all day long, without ever stopping. One oyster can filter as much as 50 gallons of water in a single day. Now multiply that by a recovering reef, by millions of oysters all doing it at once, and you start to see what came back online down there. The reef wasn't just a pile of shellfish. It had become a filter for the whole stretch of coast around it. And clean water changes everything. One of the biggest threats to a coast like this is the harmful algae bloom. When algae multiply out of control, choke the water, and poison the creatures living in it. But now that same water had something fighting back. Oysters push against those blooms directly, because the algae that fuel them are exactly what the oysters are straining out with every breath. So a healthy reef quietly works to hold the blooms in check. Researchers have linked these restored reefs to just that: cleaner water and fewer of the toxic blooms that had been part of what made this coast so sick in the first place. Once the water cleared and the reef was there, the rest of the system had what it needed to follow. A reef isn't just oysters, it's shelter and a feeding ground, a place where small creatures hide and larger ones come to hunt. As it filled back in, it became home to more and more life. And here's the part that's genuinely remarkable, though it comes with one honest qualification. According to reported accounts, as the reefs recovered, fish, turtles, and even dolphins began returning to these waters in numbers that some say hadn't been seen in over 25 years. That specific figure comes from the reporting around the project rather than a hard published count, so it's best treated as a striking claim rather than a proven fact. That transformation didn't stay underwater either. What happened on the seafloor started paying off on land as well. The payoff on land. The cleaner water didn't just help the fish, it reached people too. For the coastal communities that have always made their living from these waters, a healthier reef means a healthier catch, more oysters and more fish, and steadier income for the people who bring them in. But cleaner water protects something bigger than any single haul, because along this coast, the water is the economy. A lot of these towns run on tourism, on people coming to swim and fish and be near a clean shoreline. And when the water turns sick, that money leaves with them. A recovering reef helps keep it there. But the reefs do one more thing. They protect the land itself. A solid oyster reef sitting just off the coast works like a natural seawall. When waves and storm surge come rolling in, they hit the reef first, and the reef breaks their force before they ever reach the shore. On a coastline like Florida's, where powerful storms roll in year after year, that matters enormously. Those storms drive the surge that floods streets and tears into the homes and businesses along the water, and the damage runs into the millions every single time. A living reef standing in the way takes some of the punch out of that, quietly shielding everything behind it. It's the protection you'd normally have to build out of concrete and steel, except here it built itself, for free, out of discarded shells. So the shells that critics once called garbage ended up guarding the very coast they were afraid it would ruin. The reef pays its way on land every bit as much as it does underwater. The model spreads. The clearest proof that something works is when everyone else starts copying it. And that's exactly what happened here. Once Florida's results became undeniable, other coastlines looked at what a pile of recycled shells had done and started doing the same thing themselves. It spread first across the Gulf and up the coast. Shell recycling and reef building programs took root in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, the Carolinas, and California, each one collecting the same restaurant waste and returning it to the water. One of the largest efforts is in the Chesapeake Bay, the enormous estuary stretching across Maryland and Virginia, where a partnership between NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the federal agency responsible for the country's oceans and coasts, and the Chesapeake Bay Program, the regional body that coordinates the bay's restoration, has rebuilt a staggering amount of reef. Together, they've restored close to 2,000 acres of oyster reef, on top of the roughly 500 acres that were already there, far more than where the whole idea began. And the thinking behind it has spread even further than the shells have. Researchers in Europe and Australia have taken interest in the Florida model. and it now sits inside a whole wave of projects trying to rebuild ocean life with low-cost, natural tools. Those projects come in some surprising forms. In the Netherlands, scientists installed structures called biohuts beneath a floating solar farm to give marine life shelter. And since that study began in 2020, those structures have grown into a working ecosystem, holding hundreds of fish and thousands of tiny creatures. Elsewhere, researchers have even used underwater speakers to play the sounds of a healthy reef, drawing fish back toward dying coral to help it recover. What ties all of it together is the same simple idea Florida stumbled into, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. You don't always have to fight nature or out-engineer it. Sometimes you just have to give it back the one piece it's missing and get out of the way. 500,000 tons of restaurant garbage went into the Gulf, and what came back was a living reef where nothing had grown for years. It wasn't fast. It took 17 years and looked like failure for most of them. But it turned a dead seafloor alive again, proving nature sometimes just needs back the one piece we took away.